Hi friends, today I'm going to read Mr. Bumble by Ken Kennedy. Every spring the meadows become a buzzing and busy scene with hundreds of bumblebees gathering pollen for their hive. Such work came easily to all the bees, to all it is but one. His name was Mr. Bumble, and he was the clumsiest bee who ever buzzed. Sadly, when it came to gathering pollen, he could never take off from a flower without bumbling, fumbling, and tumbling. While the other bees buzzed back to their queen with mounds of the golden dust, Mr. Bumble always returned with the smallest share. Another empty bucket, Queen Bee would fuss. Dense are all you seem to gather. One evening, the queen held court. Something grand has happened, she announced. Today, one of our scouts buzzed over an undiscovered clover patch. There will you find a gold mine of pollen. Everyone was excited about the news, except Mr. Bumble. He couldn't help wondering what might lurk in that patch, just waiting to catch a clumsy bee. Study the map well, declared the queen, for tomorrow you journey there. But what else did the scout see? Mr. Bumble asked. Does something live in the patch? And if so, what if it's mean? Well, said the queen, if that's true, those of you who are quick and clever have nothing to fear, but those who are not, she added, looking at Mr. Bumble, beware. To Mr. Bumble, things looked grim indeed, for even if he had made it to the patch, he could only guess what terrible things awaited him there. That night he dreamed of monsters doing dreadful deeds, like plucking out his very wings. Though the next morning journey was long and hard, Mr. Bumble finally managed to arrive, but only to find that the other bees had already filled their buckets and flown away. Teetering atop a blossom, Mr. Bumble began his lonely work. Plink went the pollen into his bucket, clink went some more. But just as he was going, plinkety-clink, to the next flower, a frightful noise arose that sent a shiver around his stripes and curled his little toes. Mr. Bumble had to get out of there, and got out of there quick. But he tripped and stumbled and landed with a horrible crash. Oh no, he yelped in a helpless heap. I'm done for, he cried in fear, for not only was he seeing stars, but the bucket was stuck on his head. Suddenly he was hoisted high in the air. Please let me go, Mr. Bumble squeaked. Yet higher he went. Don't pluck out my wings, he begged. Why would we ever do that? Came a tiny voice as he was set gently upon the ground. Then the bucket was lifted away, revealing a splendid sight. Fairies, he buzzed with relief. Looking about, he realized how wrong he had been. Indeed, there wasn't one monster in the entire clover patch. As for the lift the fairies gave him, it was the best flight he'd ever had. If I could fly like a fairy, he sighed, I would gather pollen as well as the other bees. We can teach you, the fairies chimed. We'll show you how it's done. Mr. Bumble's first lesson was in taking off, so they launched him from a tiny blue bonnet. Beneath him they stretched a spiderweb net to catch him if he fell. With a boing and a buzz he sailed in the air, flying higher and straighter with each and every try, and when Mr. Bumble took off without any trouble, the fairies knew it was time for his next lesson, how to land gently upon a flower. They guided Mr. Bumble by daisy chains so he wouldn't belly flop. He learned to step on upon flowers without disturbing a single raindrop. For the first time he buzzed without bumbling, flew without fumbling, and twirled without tumblings. I can finally fly with grace, he cried. This called for a celebration, so the fairies held a flying party for Mr. Bumble, where he could give all the tricks a whirl, and never before had the sky been filled with such fancy fleets of flight. Soon it was time for Mr. Bumble to go, so he filled his bucket with pollen. Thank you, my friends, he buzzed as they all waved goodbye, and with his bucket held high, off he flew to his hive. Meanwhile, the queen was searching the evening sky. That clumsy Mr. Bumble must be lost again, she sighed. Just then she spotted a bee zipping through the air. Surely that can't be Mr. Bumble buzzing there. But who was it but Mr. Bumble who glided all the way to her throne? For her royal highness, he said, and with a buzz and a bow, he presented his astonished queen with his bucket of golden dust. Hurrah! Cheered his fellow